just before we kind of dive into anything in particular, I just kind of want to know a little bit about your experience and why you decided to become an architect.
Well, unlike many architects who knew from a young age that they really wanted to be an architect, for me it was more of an organic process. I was always very interested in making things and sort of creative problem solving and understanding how things go together. And so growing up, I did a lot of different creative explorations, from animation to ceramics to puppet making and what have you. And it was only until I got into college level that I even understood what architecture was and could be. And I think the passion grew exponentially as I dug deeper.
So you kind of had your hands in a bunch of different creative spaces and then found out that you can take that and make a career of it?
Yeah, I think there was always a fundamental need to express ideas through design, and architecture became the perfect medium because it could function at all different scales, from the level of a small space and furniture all the way to macro, how we make cities, and urban design opportunities to stitch together people and places and structures.
And I know for those who may not be familiar with the organization, so there's the American Institute of Architects who span across our country. It's international as well, and I know you're pretty involved in that organization. So can you tell me a little bit about what the National Strategic Council does?
Well, the American Institute of Architects made a concerted effort to restructure how they engage with the public, how they share knowledge, and how the profession fits into the built environment as a whole. And so the National Strategic Council was a newly created body. It's, I think, about in its 5th year now. And it was set up to be a forward-thinking entity that imagines a future and how architects and the profession fit into crafting that future. It functions somewhat as a think tank in a way, to test new ideas and to ask new questions about what if we perhaps thought about cities in different ways. The 20th century models are not going to be working in the future. So what are the replacements for how we make cities, and especially in urbanized areas, accommodate many more people in much smaller space?
And since it's a national council, do you find that there are a lot of differences in the way you need to approach architecture based on where all of these people are coming from, or is it usually about the same?
Well, actually, the body is a representative body, so it's made up of individuals who are elected by their regions. And absolutely, regionally, there are different needs. We have different climates, we have different landscapes, we have different topography and natural resources. And so the one size fits all that is often preferred by politicians and electeds in situations, we find it's precisely the opposite, that the answers to the future will be regionally and locally tailored with community input and understanding specific built environment challenges and opportunities.
That's interesting that you're coming together to discuss larger topics, but not necessarily is it going to be an approach that will help one particular region more than the other. I guess my question kind of comes down to these topics that you guys discuss, knowing that it's not one size fits all. What are the types of topics that you collectively tackle? Or is it more so somebody comes from a region and goes, I'm having this issue, how do I address it?
Well, I think the topics that are raised stem out of the organization's strategic plan and looks to better understand and heighten how architects fit back into their local community. So it may be, on the one hand, looking at things like communication. How do architects communicate with the public about how cities are made and what their role is in that process? It may have to do with specifics of the environment. In some parts of the country, we have challenges with natural disasters and resilience. So when you approach fire, perhaps in California, there's a different set of questions than rising tides in Florida, or hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast, or floodplain in the Midwest, or algae blooms in the North. So I think there's enough diversity of environmental challenges, but I think what we're interested in is how to create frameworks to be facilitators and elevate opportunities for local communities to have a voice in tackling some of these issues.
And how, I know you were a council member, so in your time on this council, what were some of the things that you particularly remember addressing?
Well, I worked on two initiatives. I should say I focused on two amongst many others, but the primary two were, one, looking at how to introduce design thinking that architects bring directly into local government from within. What we found is that historically, most cities had architects within the government in the foundation of their towns and communities. And over the latter part of the 20th century, these positions were eliminated for a variety of reasons. And the latest studies, in particular, Bloomberg Philanthropies has done some studies showing that the absence of design thinking and creative problem solving within government is a huge, huge issue. So what I've been working on with National is to how to reintroduce into local government that voice that is so needed and very much lacking right now. So often, the answer to problems are not more rules on top of additional or previous rules, but actually a design solution that, if it's well thought out, could actually be more effective than trying to implement and enforce and cite or violate individuals through behavioral modification. That actually design oftentimes can be the answer to community challenges. So that's one thing I've been working on. The second thing is a local tailored way that communities can gauge and measure environmental responsiveness in their community. And by that, I mean, it would be some sort of a indexing. When you're purchasing a new home, for example, the home buyer can have a sense of how has this home been designed in concert with nature. What is the quality of its natural light, of its cross ventilation, of the materials that were used? Has it been sited and oriented on the site in a way that's going to be best for energy efficiency to operate? Is it going to be a lower cost because of the way it was designed? There are so many things that architects bring to the thought process which have real value, but it's been very difficult to communicate that to the public. So what we're working on is a publicly accessible index or series of measurables that will help people understand why a well-designed home, for example, makes sense for them.
That's, as somebody who's currently trying to buy a house, that would be, someone who's not an architect, that would be amazing to kind of not only understand a little bit more about how the home is built, but also what that means in the long term. So that sounds like a really awesome project.
Well, we think so. I think if it's something to be developed and then tailored again at the local level, because what is appropriate in the desert climate of Phoenix is very different than in, Maine, for example, right?
Yeah.
So it would be up to each of the components to work with their communities to identify what makes a great space to live in and how that can be measured in their own town or city.
So that all of that is more on a national level. And I know that you're also involved with your state chapter, which is AIA California. You are the chair of their Housing Congress. So can you tell me a little bit about that specific section of the organization?
Yes, so the AIA is divided into three levels of engagement. So the national level really operates more on larger frameworks and policies on behalf of their members. And at the state level, or I should say the regional level, sometimes that is a state, sometimes it's multiple states. They're looking to be a conduit to the local components and help from a regional basis identify some of the issues and provide resources at the local level. And then finally, the individual chapters really are the direct connection to the public in their communities. But currently at the California regional level, I'm chairing a housing congress. As most understand from the news, that there's a very serious challenge with housing and homelessness in the California region right now. And much like most urbanized areas, there's been a gap between policies in place and the realities of how housing is actually produced, how it's funded, how it's constructed, how it's designed. There's this huge gap, let's say, between the theoretical and the policy side and the physical and the reality side. So what we're looking at the Housing Congress is how to bridge that gap and how to look at the resources that are in place, the labor that's in place, the funding sources that are in place, and understand where the true challenges lie so that we could better connect with our policymakers and help them understand what policies they could consider that they might help to better align things so that we can deliver housing much more effectively, much quicker, at a lower cost, and a higher level of quality, which is fundamental because it's not just about building more units, but it's about stitching these units into existing communities with the least amount of impact and the greatest response to the local environment, so that we're not creating new problems by trying to solve a singular problem, which is merely unit count. The issue is far beyond just adding more units. And the way I describe it is it's not so much about how do we add density to cities, but rather how do we make cities more dense? And by that, I mean, how do we integrate housing with local goods and services so that you can walk to the pet shop or the flower store or the bakery? It's not going to always be transit oriented, where we're going to expect individuals to jump onto some sort of transit to buy a loaf of bread. And so the issues and the challenges are far more profound than merely upping the unit counts of the housing. And so that's what we're primarily looking at the Congress. And then the second issue is another huge challenge related to homelessness. And there are many, many, many theories and ideas about solutions. I think as architects, we tend to look at the relationships between things and cause and effect. And so at the Congress level, we're looking not only again at how to just get some transitional housing built or some shelters built, but all the things that need to go into that to have them be effective, whether it be job training, social services, tapping into mental health resources, providing nutritional and medical services, looking at even certain cultural challenges of equity and opening the door to more and more people to the housing that they need. So it's a very broad and expansive challenge, but it's not simply about a roof over one's head. And I think we're trying to look at how to, again, bring these multiple factors into the equation that will ultimately solve it.
It's interesting that you talk about all of the it's so much more than just housing. It's, these are people. There are often things that you need to think about to get them to acclimate and give them what they need to be able to survive. So that's really interesting. As the chair of the organization, can you tell me a little bit about what you particularly do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, this Congress was formed 2.5 years ago through the leadership of our executive director at the California Council. This was a vision brought together by Paul Welch, our executive director, who is now retired, and Nikki Dennis Stevens, who has taken the mantle and been just amazingly supportive and visionary in how she has seen this Congress grow. So we're meeting a couple times over the year as a group. It's the body itself is made up of representatives from all the components in California. So we have approximately 20 individuals or so who are on this Congress. And just like we were discussing earlier, there's a whole range of both challenges and opportunities at the regional level that are very distinct. So it's been a wonderful chance to understand how, say, a community that's primarily a college community and is affected by a student population that might be there 9 months out of the year, and how housing students relates into a larger question of the town itself. And that's a very different challenge than a highly urbanized city that is looking at a population growth that is, rather large and that they're not prepared for.
And I know we kind of have talked a little bit more about how this entity works on a local scale, but how on a national scale does AIA, as well as their specific National Strategic Council, work to improve housing?
Well, I think here we need to give credit to the Large States Network. The Large States came together as a response to AIA California, AIA Illinois, and AIA Chicago, who had introduced a resolution at the national level saying that housing and homelessness have reached a level where architects need to step up in the organization, needs to start crafting a voice and opportunities for its member architects to get involved and be more influential in charting the future of our communities. And so in response to that resolution that was adopted by the membership, the large states came together, and the large states are made up of approximately 10 of our largest states, and I'm not sure the exact number, but this group formed basically a study group or discussion group who has come up with a framework that is being introduced at the national level for board consideration. And this housing framework is looking to give guidance to the regional and local level about the resources that are in place and some of the opportunities for architects and the profession to engage at the regional level. And I think it's going to be a really wonderful opportunity for the organization as a whole to identify some of the best opportunities for architects to make a difference. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, and it's nice that the large states also span across the whole country. So one thing that I find very interesting, especially as we've had this conversation, is, your issues in California may be very different from New Jersey or from Texas, from Illinois, the other large states. So together as a whole, what are the type of ways that you guys approach like environmental responsiveness, even though that you all have such different climates?
Well, I think that's one of the great successes of the Large States Network thus far as I've observed it. And I've been observing over the last 3 to 4 years. And what I find really effective is the executive directors of each of these state components communicate with one another exceedingly well. And so when there are environmental issues that arise, they're already discussing responsiveness and ways that you can energize the local components to get up to speed and really be a resource to their community when it's needed. So some of the lessons learned, for example, in California after fire and floods, could be shared with AIA New Jersey, for example. AIA Florida, who's been looking at rising tides and responsiveness to hurricanes, might have some thoughts for AIA New York when they're hit by storm fronts and what have you. Back and forth, I think there's tremendous communication and lessons learned. And then the other thing that I think is really remarkable is that these components and regions care about one another. So AIA California, for example, was able to contribute some dollars and some knowledge resources when Puerto Rico went through its most recent hurricane and some of the really severe environmental challenges and the absolute tragedy with the displacement of people from their homes. There's been beyond just knowledge sharing some funding as well, and I think it's really remarkable that these larger states that have their own individual challenges have come together so effectively. It's something that really makes me proud of the organization.
Yeah, and with the sharing of the funding and ideas, I think it also probably gives you and other people who are involved in all of these projects a little bit more of a pulse on what's going on at a national scale.
Well, I think, architects are out there doing it. We are on the front lines. We're perhaps not as effective as other organizations in communicating that to the public, but those in the know at the operational level of local governments, I think, recognize the value of architects in their community. And I think it's great that you're having this type of conversation and forum so that the public could really understand more of what architects do and why they matter, and how cities are benefiting from the work that the organization is doing.
And on that same note, we've kind of already explored that architects are very misunderstood in terms of profession. So what, in your opinion, is the number one thing that you think is most important for people to know about architects?
The number one thing, well, I think architects bring a different thought process to situations. We tend to look at cause and effect relationships and driving forces behind the way things work. And so oftentimes when we're in the room and included in a conversation, the ideas that we have, at least in my experience, individuals often comment, gee, we really haven't heard that approach before. We really haven't heard that way of thinking before. And so there's something about thinking on the right side of the brain that architects have been trained and often have an innate ability to see the world perhaps in a little different way. The example I often use is, we had a national election where in a certain state we had dangling chads, and there was endless conversation about recounting ballots and who's going to be in the room to recount and what's going to count and what how are you going to measure this. And in the end, it was a design problem. They just needed a better designed ballot, and this would have never happened. And so, I think there's value to design thinking when a right brain design oriented mindset is brought to a particular issue. Sometimes there's new opportunities that haven't been thought of. So to me, that's the number one thing that architects bring to any situation.
And it's so funny that you say design is more important than people think, because that is something I have experienced. I mean, I think we all have at some point been somewhere where you look at something and you're like, this is designed so poorly and it would make my life so much easier if it were better. So it's interesting to see that, where it's not from an architecture standpoint, but it's something that people can relate to in just their everyday lives as well.
Absolutely. And I think fundamentally architects are design thinkers. They don't just design buildings. They design environments, they design settings, they design situations, they design opportunities for engagement and other ways that people can gather and interact. And it's almost like an orchestration in a way, that there's many instruments playing, and the architect is thinking about putting everything together in a relationship that's more harmonious and expanding opportunities for more people.
Yeah. Well, that was everything that I had for you. So is there anything else that you want to get out there just for the average everyday person who may not understand the work that you do and that your coworkers do?
Well, I think there's always a mystery about who architects are and what they do. I know when I encounter people, that's often the first thing they say is, oh, it must be wonderful to be an architect, but what do you really do? And I think the thing I would say is that, you know, we're alive and well, we're out there, and hopefully in your local community, we are the ones that are providing input on new projects. We're serving on boards and commissions and panels and task forces and committees. We are out there caring about how cities are made, and that most architects are very accessible, and they love to really provide a service that makes a difference. And so each individual may think that they don't necessarily have access to design thinking, but I think it is far more accessible than most might imagine. And I would encourage individuals in their local community, especially at the small firm scale, to really drop in and get a sense of who's in their community, who are the architects that are really making a difference, because they are out there.